Alright, we are recording, and first things first, NGC 2024. This is a Spitzer Space Telescope image of the Flame Nebula, which seems appropriate because I want to talk about emergencies and responses in the Catherineverse. And fire on board a ship or a space station would definitely be an emergency, just as it is in real life. Yeah. So I'm just looking at my notes here. I'm going to try to be quick. We'll see how well that goes for me. But yeah, basically, emergencies that they do happen. It can be tempting when you are thinking about some science fiction future, that emergencies don't happen, or there's always some convenient, easy response, but, well, that's not always real. Emergencies are emergencies. If they weren't emergencies, like if you had that convenient solution to them, then they're no longer emergencies. They're just events. But to help put this in context, the two closest analogies I can think of, not that I'm very knowledgeable of emergencies, but the two closest I can think of on Earth would be emergencies on a ship at sea. In that you're kind of stuck on the ship. I mean, technically, you could jump into the water, and that's where this analogy fails. Because if you're on a spaceship in dark space, you can't go anywhere. There's no atmosphere outside. You don't have the ocean. Wherever you go needs to be as contained an environment as the one you just left. So that's not really an option. I mean, yes, there's the idea of lifeboats or escape pods, things like that, but those get really kind of wishy-washy when you think about it. I mean, it's like, is something really that small? Like, sometimes it seems like they're depicted as being the size of an elevator. You really expect that to have full atmosphere capabilities? I mean, it'll last for some time, and that's fine, but you need the response to be very quick then, and I'm going to get to responding there, but it is basically, my point there is sometimes leaving the ship might not be that viable. That's more so my opinion on some stuff with escape pods. Some situations great, other situations not so much. Anyhow, so yeah, that's the one analogy, is like a ship having an emergency at sea. Another, and I think this would be more appropriate actually, is a closer analogy, would be an emergency in some sort of mine, especially a deep mine that requires powered ventilation for there to be atmosphere moving down there. That is something that is definitely true of a lot of mines. When you go deep enough, the air will foul very quickly because there's no movement. It's not being cycled with the outside. It's just what's there. And you'll actually see this in some like classic Western TV shows. The idea of having air shafts that would have been passive, but today obviously you would actually power that somehow so you can go deeper, or just to make the air shafts more efficient than just passive convection of air moving back and forth. I'm just checking over. Oh, and also though, with an emergency in a mine, the only resources you have would be those you have with you, and those people bring when they get to you, assuming they do, or rather that they were able to get there quickly. So, in the Catherineverse, and this is actually set up in Chapter 1 of A Letter from Catherine, I have it open on my desktop here. I described that basically there's a three-tier system to this, but it's not tiered like a triage system where it's like, oh, this is the highest priority, this is the next highest. No, it's tiered as in there's three classifications, three tiers for responses to it. So the first is basically you immediately respond. That's somebody has an emergency, the alert goes out. If you're in that group, you're going. Doesn't matter what you're doing, you need to go and take care of that. Well, actually, take that back. It does matter. There are some exceptions to this, but I do actually put in there that while there are exceptions, even when they can't apply, that doesn't mean a pilot invokes them. They may be like, okay, yeah, going to respond. And it might be worth noting that part of this, why the pilots would always respond like that, or would want to respond that way, is they know they're the ones that need to help. Like, if you're the closest, you're going to help. There isn't there's an ambulance or something. No, you might be the only one to respond within an hour, or even more, just because of the distances involved here. So no, you would be ready to respond mentally and also physically. You would make sure that you have the ability to respond with your ship. So yeah, that's the first one, which is just you go. The second classification is a reserve classification, which is you're allowed to finish, what I described there is you're allowed to finish what you're currently doing. So in A Letter from Catherine, the main character is Roman. He's a courier. He brings things back and forth between Earth and a space station. He can finish his run. He may request that he can exceed certain speed limits so that he can, deliver and then get ready to move to a staging area, which is also part of the reserve classification, where you finish what you're doing, then you go to the staging area because you're the reserve. So when the first classification, when they're exhausted or just needing to be replaced, like they pulled people out. Okay, well, someone needs to go in to get more people. That's the reserve. Yep, that's that point. And then there is the third level, which is a support classification, which is basically, hey, you can keep doing what you're doing, but we're gonna need you probably. It's just we may be calling you in. It's just so that you can be ready. And it's not like you're going to be surprised. And actually something in the story is very important about that, because I want to keep this video kind of short and not just start going into hypothetical emergencies, but one of the things... Well, here, let me actually see if I can find it. If I can find the quote. Yes. So this is in chapter 10, if you would get a copy of the book and look at it. It's Roman recounting, the whole chapter is him actually recounting an emergency he responded to months before the events of the book, but specifically with a planetary colony. And instantly the urgency of the situation was obvious because it was from the colony Jeb 3, and it was given a support classification, just like I explained to the class yesterday. Chapter 1 was yesterday. 99 times out of 99, an emergency on a planet does not need support pilots, but this had to be that 100th. You can read the book to find out what the exact emergency is. But that's very accurate for how I envision this stuff. That it's like, whatever an emergency there can be on a planet, you can go outside on a planet. I think I tried doing another video earlier. I think I did mention that, if there's a fire on a ship, you can't leave it. Well, if there's a fire on a planet, you can't step outside and escape a fire. Bad weather, you can move. Like, there are ways you can escape an emergency on a planet. So it does make sense that if there is an emergency, people need to respond quickly. It can even make sense that there be a reserve level, because maybe it is you need to move a lot of people, so you need a reserve ready. But support, no, you would basically never bother with that, because a planet that already supports life will continue to support life. It's very unlikely for that to become an issue. So support, you'd never alert anyone for that. There'd be no need. But this was that one time where, no, actually, suddenly they do need. And you can read the book to find out more. I'm just... Oh, yes. One thing that I do mention in there is that in one of the previous recordings, I don't remember which, the one talking about communication. No, the logistics one. It's the logistics video. I talk about the controllers, the concept of controllers. Who are, basically who the pilots are in communication with, and they, if you need to adjust your flight path there, who would order that or who you'd have to clear it with. But one thing that I do mention in the book is that when an emergency is declared and you are alerted, you stay with the controller then that you're on. It doesn't matter where you are, because technically, like between Earth and his space station, Roman swaps controllers. There's one for the space station, one for the Earth. I think I swapped my hands, but anyway. And he does, as he gets nearer to Earth or nearer to the space station, it changes. Not when there's an emergency. You stay with that controller because you need that continuity. That will help with the emergency situation. Though, once you get to a staging area, it is reasonable that there you would start answering to, you'd have like an emergency controller then. I don't specifically say that in the story, but it is reasonable to me, so the way I wrote that section, it's not exactly too relevant. He starts talking with the dude who's basically managing the emergency response. So, in effect, then he has that controller. But yeah, as that guy is the controller. Okay. Let me just see what else. Yeah, nothing else except before getting into the different possible emergencies, and I don't want to get too deep into that. Um, but yeah, just the idea of it is just other pilots who would be responding. It isn't. I know in other videos I've mentioned the concept of the military and that they do exist to secure trade routes and such. And so yes, they would have ships patrolling that would naturally respond to any alert. And many of their ships would be better designed to respond than a normal uh, consumer ship, commercial ship. But that doesn't mean they're there to respond. It doesn't mean they're the nearest one. So you do have this kind of independent mindset where you need to be able to take care of yourself, but it is also when somebody else needs help, you go and help them. That you all work together because you need to work together. That's just part of the mindset for these people. It's one of those funny things where sometimes the most independent of people are also the ones who are most ready to go and help because they understand that when they need help, when it's something beyond their capability, then you do need somebody, so you also react when somebody needs help as well. I'm just trying to think, is it worth... Okay, you know what? Maybe that. The idea of emergency systems. I don't, as I said, I don't want to get into hypotheticals on emergency situations that come up because there's so many different ones, like fire. I mentioned, which would be very real. Well, you know what? No, we'll go through that one. If you have a fire on a ship, you might be tempted. I know in Star Trek, it's like, oh, we'll wait, make a little force field that'll stifle it. It's like, I don't have force fields in my fiction, so I can't do that. I'm not sure I like the idea anyway. Just doesn't necessarily seem that seems too much oh yeah, we can just do this everywhere. And it's like, really? It's also, when you stop and think about it, why is it then that they don't, like, somebody boards a ship, why aren't you just using a force field around them to contain the atmosphere to knock them out? I was like, it starts getting into one of those, hey, we have this technology, why aren't we using it in this situation? We forgot it as writers, that's why. So, sorry, it's just, but yeah, so with fires, it would make sense that if it's in a room, you try to seal off the room to contain it. I don't think you would ever want to vent atmosphere, though, because if you're doing that, it's like you need that to breathe as well. So that's a very dangerous thing. I could see adjusting the atmosphere, so reducing the oxygen, or maybe just increasing carbon dioxide, so you stifle out of fire that way. Maybe you could try exhausting the air out of the room and into other rooms. Maybe, but I don't really like that idea because potentially you would be pulling up sparks and cinders and such, which may just spread the fire. So yeah, don't care much for that. I think it would most likely you would just still have fire extinguishers. Why not? Why not? But yeah, there is just that element of you want to be careful with certain things because while you do have control over the atmosphere, you don't have a massive atmosphere around you that you can pull from. It's all limited quantities. Yeah, so it would make sense if you can seal off the room, evacuate, get people away from that, do that, and let the fire burn out. In plenty of cases, there's nothing wrong with that if that is the most reasonable response. Okay. I could probably go on some more about fires, especially if I start talking about space stations. I don't want to do that. I want to leave that for other videos. But one thing that I will mention about emergency systems, because I do describe some in a letter from Catherine, one in particular, because this is one that I just like this. I'll explain. Lighting, emergency lighting. And what I describe in here is that, two main things. One is that the emergency lighting system has a 60-to-1 rule concerning charging them. Meaning that if you have a external power source, you hook it up to the emergency lighting, and you charge it for 1 minute, the lights will stay on for a full hour. They will be dim, but sometimes that can be enough. There's no other light source if you're inside of a ship that has lost power. There are no lights on. And it's also, in the case of a letter from Catherine, when Roman is on such a ship, He has his spacesuit, so he also has his own lights, he has his own sensors and all that, so the additional ambient light does help. It is still very helpful, but there are other things to make up for it being dim. So there's that's very sci-fi. I know I'm hand waving there. How do you get 60 to 1? That seems absurd. But the other thing, and this is the more me kind of thing, they're incandescent bulbs. They're not LEDs. They're not fluorescents. They're incandescent. Why? Brownouts. Seriously, that is the short way of putting it. An incandescent bulb, because of how that lighting system works, at low power will still light up. It is dim, but it is still lit up. Whereas the nature of an LED, there's a minimum voltage necessary for them to turn on. You don't have power, or you have very limited power, meaning you don't have lights. That's not helpful. So it makes sense to actually use incandescent bulbs. But at the same time, though, I do describe, and this is a real technology. It's been a long time since I've seen anything on it. But there is an enhanced version of incandescent bulbs, where you actually have the filament encased in a material that reflects infrared light. Because what's the big criticism for incandescent bulbs is a lot of the energy that they are putting out is infrared, not visible light. Now, there are cases where that heat is actually useful. Streetlights. I'm dead serious. I am aware of at least one town that replaced all their incandescent bulbs in their streetlights and traffic lights with LEDs. They thought it would be great and regretted it the very first winter because the heat from the bulbs melts snow. LEDs don't put out enough heat, so suddenly all these streetlights are useless. Yeah, so incandescent bulbs are not just inferior. They just serve different purposes. Anyway, what these enhanced bulbs did, or rather how they were designed, is they encapsulated the filament in a material that would actually reflect infrared light. Or sometimes it would, I think I've also described where they would have beads where the infrared light would be bounced back into the filament. So that would heat the filament up more. Well, the filament works by black body radiation. You heat it up enough and it glows. Well, some of that energy is going to infrared. If you're bouncing back into the filament, then it heats it up more. So it actually is increasing the efficiency because effectively less energy is lost. It's not leaving the bulb as infrared light. It goes back into the filament, heats it up more, it'll be brighter. So there is also that element that these would be enhanced, highly efficient incandescent light bulbs. And that's like, hey, it's my science fiction. I know about this technology. I'm going to use it because it makes sense. Because this would not have that limitation of LEDs where, oh, you need a minimum voltage for it to work at all. Nope. It would work like standard incandescent bulb, but be far more efficient. And it's been a while since I saw that research. I think that they were actually talking about how those bulbs that they had built in the lab were comparable in efficiency to LEDs. But there are various advantages to incandescent bulbs. It's a more natural light because it's black body radiation, which is also how the light from the sun works. So it is more natural, as I just said. So yeah, I use those as emergency lights because of the brownout situation. They can be dim. It's called a brownout because the light was dim. It was brown, but it wasn't black. Yeah, that's a term that might be lost in our future, though, because of the push to LEDs, which are great for some things, not great for everything. Anyway, that's probably enough for this one. See you next time.